People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. In 11 hours from now, voting will commence for over 17 million registered voters to choose from among 38 candidates at 13,421 polling stations to elect into office the 9th Executive President of Sri Lanka. During the course of this program, we will be exercising care to be fully compliant with election laws and guidelines during this silent period. I'm pleased to welcome back to the show Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu, Executive Director of the Centre for Policy Alternatives. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening.
I'm also joined by Sankhitha Gunaratne, Attorney at Law, also the Head of Governance and Anticorruption at Verite Research. Good evening and welcome back, Sankhitha.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, before delving into the importance of the preservation of the integrity of the electoral process in Sri Lanka, I'd like to ask both of you, how are you? How do you choose to be hopeful amidst all the noise? How do you manage to keep the fight going? Dr. Saravanamuttu.
Well, I suppose I've always been a cautious optimist in that there's a great deal of ruin in any country. I remember in the 1970s, people would write books, including Tariq Ali, Can Pakistan Survive? And it has been survival albeit, but nevertheless, it hasn't disintegrated. So I think at the end of the day, the question is, how much do the people of a country really want to see that country succeed? And succeed means that they have rights but also have responsibilities. They must be willing to make sacrifices to move ahead, and I think we can do it.
Sankhitha?
I think change is always incremental, and as long as you keep your sights on the end goal, you don't have a choice but to keep going. And the fact that change also happens in our lifetime is something that we have seen. So speaking of anti-corruption and governance, we found that the Right to Information Act, for example, has been operationalized in Sri Lanka after nearly a 30-year campaign. So some of these campaigns and movements towards better governance and better fights against corruption last beyond electoral cycles. They go beyond lifetimes and generations, and that's something, that's a baton that keeps needing to be passed on, and we're just part of that.
Lovely. Dr. Saravanamuttu, we're looking at the election of the 9th Executive President of Sri Lanka. There's a great deal of voter interest, and this will be the first election after the 2022 Aragalaya as well. Speak to us about this concept of having a free and fair election sans violence and manipulation.
Well, basically the point about a free and fair election is that the electors, us, the citizens, are not in any way intimidated or threatened or coerced in order to vote for one or another party. Furthermore, that the process of casting of the ballot and counting of the ballot is also free from interference, so that no one can get up and question the legitimacy of that. Then, of course, you have the question of campaign finance, and this time we have passed a campaign finance law. Now, I'm not so sure that, you know, the argument that the person who spends the most amount of money can buy an election as such, but nevertheless, there is an element of truth in that, and it is good to instill a certain amount of discipline as far as the candidates are concerned. Then you have social media. Now, I think in this election, social media has played a very big part, and social media is going to play even more of a bigger part in coming elections, not just here in Sri Lanka, but elsewhere in the world as well. And so we have the challenge of how does one regulate hate speech, misinformation, and all of that. And I think the tendency on the part of the public is to go to a social media website that will serve as an echo chamber of their views rather than contest their views.
Right.
So there are a number of different dimensions that we have to look at. Well, we have begun to do it, but let's see whether we can get any kind of comprehensive survey of how to regulate social media. So there are a number of new sort of technological challenges, as well as the basic political and ethical challenge of, do you believe in a functioning democracy? And if you believe in a functioning democracy, how committed are you to ensure that the processes and the institutions of that functioning democracy function as they are intended to?
Speak to us about how these statutes will assist meaningfully in this journey towards taking the country on a path of actively pursuing anti-corruption.
Right, thanks, Anali. So the conversation on anti-corruption, as you said, while it has germinated and festered over at least the past 10 years, if you see, the focus of the people has been around enforcement and implementation. But the focus that we've seen, even with the onset of the IMF program, has been on legislating on anti-corruption. So what we need to see as a new government come into play, whichever it is how well that government succeeds in bridging that gap. That's in terms of the conversation. But getting to the specific points of the campaign finance law and the Anti-Corruption Act in the context of this election, as Dr. Saravanamuttu mentioned, this is the first time that the campaign finance law is being tested. But we know that the law itself has several weaknesses. For example, the law only provides for a campaign spending limit for the candidates and parties, but not for a contribution limit. So through regulating a spending limit, you can rein in things perhaps like the abuse of public resources, like vote buying. But it doesn't address the problem of undue influence, because there is no cap on how much money or in-kind contributions can be made to individuals or parties or independent groups. At the same time, another key weakness in the law itself is that it doesn't build in a good monitoring mechanism. So what it calls for is that each candidate or party, after the election is declared, within 21 days should provide a return of their income and expenses to the Election Commission. Then within 10 days thereof, the Election Commission has to take out an advertisement in the newspapers saying that this information is available for people to access with the payment of a certain fee. Now, that process is very archaic. What we need is a digital system that can run red flags that people can access immediately, that becomes part of the public conversation, for there to be proper monitoring of this system, even if the state were not to monitor. If we were just going to depend on citizens to monitor and raise the alarm on infractions about the law. Another problem with this campaign spending limit that was imposed this year, irrespective of whether the limit is too high or too low, is about the timing that is stipulated in the law to announce the spending cap. Now this time they have given a spending cap of 109 rupees per voter. So each candidate can spend up to 109 rupees per voter as part of their campaign expenses, which amounts to about 1.8 billion rupees per candidate that they can spend. Now, the timeline of when that is announced was 5 days after nomination, within 5 days after nominations close. That's what the law stipulates. But we know that the campaigning for this particular election started months and possibly years before that. So the effectiveness of the law itself is in question. And then we come to the point of enforcement. Will we see the Election Commission really going through these reams and reams of paper and looking at whether violations have occurred, whether the disclosures will be accurate, whether they will triangulate this information against, say, information that the Financial Intelligence Unit will have about sanctioned individuals or companies, information that with the company registrar about shareholding of companies that have contributed to the campaigns, because those are banned. Foreign companies are banned from contributing. So how well will this enforcement take place is another question. So the original proposed law had a system where all campaign contributions had to go through a single bank account. But that was done away with this campaign finance law that was suddenly brought out in a rush in the run-up to the local government elections. So we have these key issues in relation to the law itself on campaign finance and on the implementation and enforcement of it this time around. So we hope to see that the Election Commission takes proactive measures and coordinated measures with other law enforcement authorities in truly bringing this law and implementation to fruition. On the Anti-Corruption Act, I must start with a positive thing that we have seen for this election. Upon applications and representations being made with the CBOC, that is the Bribery Commission this year, we see in this election for the first time in Sri Lanka's history the asset declarations of all 38 presidential candidates having been published on the on the Bribery Commission website on cboc.gov.lk for the perusal of the voters. Now that is great strides, that is a great stride that has been made, and credit should be given to the public officials who have made this happen. Of course, it comes in the context of the moment that we are in, and also, as I talked about, a campaign that has run for so many years. So that's one good thing that has come out of the introduction of the Anti-Corruption Act. But speaking to even elections, campaign financing, and the Anti-Corruption Act, the new Anti-Corruption Act allows the Bribery Commission to look at money laundering in the context of bribery and corruption. Now, we know campaign financing is a prime way through which money laundering is done. People contribute to campaigns to legitimize or to whitewash black money. So whether, again, enforcement will kick in by the Bribery Commission, by coordination through the Bribery Commission and the Election Commission, all of these are things that are up in the air. But what we do need to see is that all these commissions need to be allowed the independence to act in an unbiased way going forward, so that any violations or infractions that take place in the run-up to these elections and immediately thereafter can be addressed.
Thank you. That was most comprehensive. Dr. Saravanamuttu, across the years, something that we've seen is watered down versions of statutes which are done for the sake of brought for the sake of bringing them. We've seen statutes being brought in the most non-consultative manner, and the tasks are entrusted to government institutions which are severely under-resourced and underfunded, and so much of politicization taking place. So in such a backdrop, just bringing forward the legislation in itself doesn't really serve a purpose, and we have plenty of examples of that nature. So then what do we do over and above statutes? What more is there to bring forth change, reform?
Well, I suppose the short answer to it is the Aragale. Politicians want votes, and votes belong to people. If they find out that the people are angry, desperate, frustrated by what they're doing, by providing broken promises, and this is not unintentionally, in some cases they know very well that they cannot deliver, by hoodwinking the people, that the people get angry and they come out and in effect demonstrate that they are being the change, or they're representing the change that they want to see happen, because that's what democracy at the end of the day is all about. That's what the whole talk about people's sovereignty is about. But, you know, the thing is this, is that in the manifestos, as I said earlier, they either intentionally come up with promises that they know they cannot keep, or inadvertently they will say, yes, we promised this, but when we came into government we found out that the story was entirely different, particularly with regard to finances and all of that. So we need to have transparent and accountable government, not just at the point of elections, but right through. We need to have that so that people know, are properly informed, to make informed decisions at the polls, you know. So at the end of the day, I guess that responsibility is on us, on civil society, on us, because we are at the end of the day the ultimate check and balance on the exercise of political power.
Sankhitha, since you highlighted a few issues with the existing laws pertaining to campaign finance, money laundering, and the Anticorruption Act, speak to us about how important it is for the Sri Lankan state to enlist the services of international agencies in terms of international cooperation and support on these anti-corruption efforts.
So let's be frank, there is only so far that international assistance can take us. So internally, domestically, we need to figure out the problem of political will. Without political will, or at the very least, independence of law enforcement authorities, we are not going to get anywhere, even if we get international assistance. But we do need international assistance when it comes to our capacity issues. So we need expertise, we need assistance to bolster our institutions, to get the resources in place, and technical assistance also in the implementation of these laws that we have now, to a certain extent, put in place. So on that count, I think there's been a lot of conversation about the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, which is a joint initiative of the World Bank and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. So the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, that is STAR, can come in to assist countries like Sri Lanka if they were interested in carrying out asset tracing and asset recovery mechanisms to bring back to the country money that has been illegally siphoned away from countries like Sri Lanka. However, there is a big if, there is a big condition that they need to receive a very distinct, specific invitation from the executive of a country for them to be able to provide that assistance. So that's where I say this question of political will really comes into play. It's not something that citizens can agitate and necessarily do successfully if we want to see domestic accountability for things that have been done. So we need political will and independence, ideally, combined with international assistance from the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative. There are organizations that work on procurement, that work on issues like beneficial ownership of companies, you know, how company ownership structures are used to hide corruption, to do things like money laundering. So to do all of that, we can and do need international assistance, but it can only go so far if we don't have political will and independence.
On that note, we're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
The People's Platform.
Step away from the conventional art of storytelling. Get ready for the Newsfirst Breakfast Rundown with me, Zulfikar Farzan.
Hey, Benja! මේ මිනිහා ආගම දාමත් ඉස්සර කරන් මේ කෙරියන් ටොම් පස් වල හැටියට අම්මව වහින වෙලාවට එකට එක වහලා යටින්නත් බයයි. ඔය රෙජිස්ටර් කරනවා කියලා දාපු ලියුම් ඒ හැටියට ගියා නම් මගේ ලොකු එකා මේ වෙනකොට මොන්ටිසෝරි යනවා.
එහෙම නිකන් ලොකු කන් දාන්න ලෑස්ති වෙන්න බා මේ.
අද රාත්‍රී 8:30ට
සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්
මම පෝස්ට් එක ඩිසයින් කරලා print කරෙව්වා happy birthday useless හරක් පැටියා කියලා.
කොහොම හරි අන්තිමට හැරි ඔයා මහ පොළොවට බරක් විතරක් නුනා.
ඉන්නේ අද රාත්‍රී 9:30ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්.
The voice of the nation determines its future through every choice, with every vote.
Newsfirst.
Bringing you the latest updates first and fast, with the truth at its core and real-time data.
Catch every detail with expert analysis, answer to your questions and the unexpected uncovered.
Stay ahead of the curve with the latest technology, one update at a time throughout the day.
Feel the pulse of the election.
on your screens. Stay connected and informed
with Newsfirst.
Sri Lanka decides. Sri Lanka decides. The People's Platform.
Welcome back. I'm in conversation with Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu and Sankhitha Gunaratne. Dr. Saravanamuttu, how must we go about challenging the passivity of the voter? How must we go about educating the voter and the citizenry that their role as citizens, as voters, does not end with casting the vote?
Well, okay, you know, one would like to think that we can introduce into our education system ways and means of informing people of what it is like to be a member of a functioning democracy. You teach them about their rights, but you also teach them about their duties. But that's a long-term thing. In the absence of that, how can you get to them? So, social media as an instrument provides us with a variety of ways in which we can reach out to people, from the Facebook to the YouTube to the TikTok to the Instagram. There are a whole number of ways in which we have to make our message focused and accessible to the vast majority of people. And I think that is a problem that those organizations who've been trying to inform and educate people perhaps have failed to realize that today it's a very different kind of scenario. People are not going to read long and lengthy and sometimes turgid appeals to them to do X and Y. So we have to do it in that attractive kind of way. We also have to consider that we can go to court. I mean, I've been now the executive director of the Center for Policy Alternatives, and when we started off, I think we were one of the, if not the only one of the very few organizations that actually took the government to court with regard to violations of the Constitution, fundamental rights, and all of that. That is one way of focusing public attention. Even if you do not win in the courts, what you are doing is focusing public attention on an issue that has been underreported or ignored. So that's another way of getting people to do it. And otherwise, it's basically, I suppose, communicating, whether it be through song, through dance, through plays, through whatever, to grab their attention and make them realize that the predicament that we are in, they have also contributed to it. You know, I've always said that, look, you know, it's not a question of, it's like sort of going to see a play. You buy a ticket, you cast a vote. You then watch the play. You watch the farce that passes for governance. Then you go back home and you criticize it and cut it to shreds. But you don't do anything about it. We can't just be an audience. We have to be stakeholders. And as being stakeholders, I mean, you know, democracy requires eternal vigilance. You can't sit back and expect the government to do whatever it does, because once people get political power, and particularly executive power, they change. And unfortunately, I think in our situation, it's probably been for the worse.
Sankhitha, a connected question to you. What is the role of public awareness and education in combating corruption?
I think the public is the best watchdog in terms of corruption, but there is a role for everybody to play. As Dr. Saravanamuttu was saying, you can't sit back and watch the play unfold. You have to be an active, iterative part of the democratic picture. So that would, just to bring it down to brass tacks, that would mean things like filing a right to information request. That's possibly the simplest thing you can do, to ask a question. And this has a dual effect. One is that it can catch corruption when it happens, but second, it can act as a deterrent, because the more you normalize the questioning process, and it doesn't have to be a big challenge, the filing of a right to information request is a conversation that the citizen is entitled to have with their representative. So it's a conversation that you can have by filing a right to information request and not then hiding behind it and being afraid of having done it, but to give a call and say, here, I've sent this request, would you be able to provide me with the information? I'm happy to provide more specificity if you want. You know, having that conversation, normalizing that. So you don't get to sit back between elections. So, and the right to information is a great tool that we have that can be used, and that is actually being implemented at a good level, moderately good level in Sri Lanka. If you look at the appeals before the Right to Information Commission, in 80 to 90% of instances, the Right to Information Commission has asked government to give the information to the citizens. So it's not like all those other things that are not working, it's something that is working, so you don't have an excuse not to engage using that. Another one, and I'm picking up of what Dr. Saravanamuttu said, is the idea of litigation, right? Litigation, and I want to specifically talk about litigation for policy contribution. And one thing that can be done in the absence of a consultative lawmaking process in Sri Lanka is to do bill challenges, to challenge a draft law the moment it is placed on the order paper of Parliament. And a good example of this, and how it panned out is a different story, but a good example of this is when the online safety bill was gazetted. We saw about 46 petitioners going to court. Now this was right after the Aragalaya had come to its unfortunate end. You know, at that point, I was heartened to see that energy from the streets actually converting into the formal spaces. Sure. And this was a formal space within which you can make your view heard and contribute to the policy and lawmaking process. So that's another specific instance. So we know the audience here today also will have many experts on different subjects that they care about. So watching out for that kind of legislation and contributing to those processes is another way to ensure that loopholes are not written into the law, laws are not passed without the consent of the public. And in general, we know each actor has a different role to play. So, and understanding the limitations and the playoff of those actors is also really important. So, for example, we will see investigative journalists doing a key role in finding evidence of certain corruption scandals and putting them out there. But that is where their role ends, and then the role of citizens, civil society activists begin, right? And that's also where the role of the authorities who should be taking action begins. And in the same way, you go to the next state. Who are the supervisory authorities? Does COPE and COPA do inquiries about these things, right? Can the Bribery Commission start an investigation on their own motion because they have the power to do so? So we need to have all of these actors working and citizens acting as watchdogs and all of these actors for the anti-corruption kind of jigsaw to fall into place.
Fabulous. Dr. Saravanamuttu, when we speak about the social contract theory, I'd like your perspectives on the psychology and the attitudes, this entitlement behind how all of this plays out. Sri Lankans sometimes, the citizens sometimes think of themselves as those who are being ruled by a ruler. We forget that we have rights. We adhere to our responsibilities, but we are afraid of the rulers. We don't recognize that it is our public servants who owe us their duty. So this relationship that is imbalanced and skewed has to be challenged. Why do we see those in public office and bow down? Why are we afraid of them? Why do we sir them and madam them? Why is that?
I think basically we are a feudal society that perhaps has gone towards a semi-feudal state, but as long as that feudal element is there, you're going to get the politics of patronage. You're going to get the culture of entitlement where those lower down or believe that they are lower down in a social order is going to look up to those who are the leaders and expect the leaders to take care of them. And they will serve them faithfully. I mean, this very simple thing of people going down on their knees and worshipping a politician, a school teacher, whoever, I think that is absolutely ridiculous. And that ought to be prevented by these people, you know. But it is that notion that, you know, we have leaders or governors or whatever it is, and then we have their servants or the people who do their bidding, and because you do their bidding, you expect something from them. Now look at our situation in this country. We have given the general population, have got free education, free health, and then you get a job in the public service. There are no KPIs, no key performance indicators. You're there for life. I think there was a time when a government with the World Bank started trying to train graduates to go and work in the private sector. But immediately the government changed and there were promises of extra jobs in the public service. Everyone left that program and joined the public service. Because what do you get? You get security of tenure. So from womb to tomb you're looked after, and no questions are asked in terms of where that money is coming from. Someone pays for free education. Someone pays for free health. There's no such thing as a free lunch, as they say. And that is again the question that we are facing, I think, in this election, in terms of we have 1.4 million public servants. Instead of talking about ways in which you're going to reduce them and retrain them and whatever, they're talking about giving them 25 to 30,000 to 10,000 increases. That's absurd. That is absolutely absurd. So that has to stop by a government taking the bull by the horns, as it were, and saying that, look, this is totally unsustainable. We have to allow people to go. We're not going to take on new people. We have to allow people to go. And we need a public service that is based on merit and not just a place that is a job bank for political supporters and flunkies, you know. So I think, I mean, the thing is this, is that when you look at South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, those three main countries, they all fought for independence. There was a widespread, broadly centered independence movement. Here there wasn't. And in 1931, when we were given adult universal franchise, the colonial authorities sort of felt that we were entirely suitable to get that, because we would behave like British gentlemen or English gentlemen, as it were, when it came to our politics, you know. So it's only after 1956, when that was broken, that you got the mass of people coming into politics. And, you know, again, when Parliament first sat in 1956, the doors were open and the people stormed the chamber. They took the mace. It was ape andur. You know, so we have to recognize that in order to change that, we need to broad base leadership, party membership, all of that has to be broad based. I mean, you know, our parties are still run by dynasties, yeah, more or less. So that has all got to change.
Yeah, but who's going to change it?
We have to change it. We have to change it. If anyone is going to change it, we have to change it. And we have to take that political responsibility to move from being children or adolescents to being grown adults when it comes to political literacy, when it comes to questions like equality. I mean, for example, we talk about equality, political equality. Look, there are certain parts of this country which are light years away from other parts of this country. It should not be equality, it should be equity. That's the principle on which we should base this development and growth, you know, and we have to move into the 21st century, you know. I hope that with greater economic opportunities that are being fulfilled and realized, etc., that these distinctions will go. The expectation that the state has to look after you and take care of you. So we need to move into a world which is fast going to be the case that probably within the next 10 to 20 years, about 30% of the jobs will be AI. And we have to be ready for that because we also have an aging population.
Sankhitha, what measures can the citizen, the average citizen, take in terms of challenging misuse of public property by politicians? How can they go about utilizing provisions of the Anti-Corruption Act? How can they challenge in instances where campaign finance regulations are being violated, because it's plain to see some of these instances. So how must the common man act to hold these political players accountable?
Right. So let's first talk about the election itself.
Sure.
Right. So the abuse of public resources for the purposes of an election is illegal. And it's illegal as per guidelines issued by the Election Commission. Each election, they issue guidelines that sets out the parameters of these offences, and this is underpinned by a constitutional provision. Right, so it is illegal abusing public resources. Now, what are public resources? That would be government vehicles, public officials, their time, buildings, all of that, and public finance using government budgets. We know there have been many instances in the past for election purposes where government budgets have been abused. Now, this is illegal, and to take action about this, what citizens can do is to make complaints, and they can make complaints directly to the Election Commission, or they can speak to the election observer organizations. Dr. Saravanamuttu heads one, the Centre for Monitoring Election Violence, affiliated to the Centre for Policy Alternatives. There are others, PAFREL, CAFE, Transparency International Sri Lanka, Mothers and Daughters of Lanka, all these organizations that are actually jointly and collaboratively engaging in this exercise of monitoring election abuse, anything that comes in the way of the carrying out of free and fair elections. So citizens can reach out to them, and they would immediately take steps to verify the accuracy of that, to gather further information around that, to buttress these complaints and inform the Election Commission. Now, this is most important in that preventative space, because if election violations had taken place, now we are in the moratorium, technically violations or any campaigning shouldn't be taking place, but at that point those organizations could make complaints to the Election Commission, and the Election Commission could take preventative action. But even after the conducting of elections, it's completed, there is action that the Election Commission can take, and there is action that citizens and the civil society organizations can take to take legal action, to file complaints, file petitions, file fundamental rights cases, to take action about the violations. In accordance with the Anti-Corruption Act also, outside of an election period, the abuse of public resources, conflicts of interests, the perversion of tender, like government purchasing processes, all of that can be encompassed, and there is a plethora of laws. In Sri Lanka, we don't have a lack of laws. Honestly, there may be certain niche areas that still need to be addressed, but we don't have a lack of laws for citizens to take action against corruption. But they need to know that the Siabok hotline is 1954. They can call them. They can call the Election Commission. They can call the police. Complaints can be made with the CID. So we know of even recent instances with the, the health scandal, with citizens going and making a complaint with the CID that led to the entire criminal prosecution beginning. And then the CID stepping in, the police, and then even the Bribery Commission stepping in to the prosecution process. So those are possible if citizens will only take those first steps that are required. But I realize, and I understand, we have to acknowledge that citizens need to have trust in the system for them to come forward, put their life on the line, put their time into making complaints and things like that. So this is why we constantly also urged the state authorities to demonstrate that they are acting independently, that they're making full use of their powers, that they are taking action irrespective of those that are in power, so that citizens will feel empowered, emboldened to come forward. So we see such certain steps being taken, like the publication of the asset declarations of presidential candidates that could have well been delayed till the next election, till actually March next year. The Bribery Commission has time to put into place or to operationalize all of the provisions of the Act. But they took a proactive measure in response to representations to do that. So even those small steps go a long way towards building that trust, and that is also necessary corresponding to citizen action.
Dr. Saravanamuttu, let's talk a bit about political manifestos, election manifestos by candidates. They are usually done by ad agencies. They're glossy, fabulous. How seriously can we, the citizens, take these election manifestos? Shouldn't we have an accountability mechanism through which we can see the implementation of these processes? Have we left room for political candidates to come into service and then say, oh, look, I didn't really know that this was the reality of the country's finances?
Well, I mean, the thing is this, is that, you know, a political party can say X and Y and Z in the campaign and put it in its manifesto. And then when they do come into government, they can find out that the figures that were given out by that government were completely exaggerated or whatever. Because that's what politics is about. It's about sort of putting your best foot forward and sometimes being very economical with the truth with regard to what you put forward. But the thing with regard to election manifestos is, yes, it's like a sort of advertising brochure. But nevertheless, it is an advertising brochure which is based on an element of truth. So we must hold them to that. And I suppose the ultimate action that we have is that when it comes to an election, we turf them out because they did not come to fulfill any of their manifesto promises. But the thing, of course, with the manifesto promises is this, is that it seems to attract a lot of public attention because they're broad-based and they're generalized. People want change. All right, what is the change that they want may not be in that manifesto in terms of the details, the dotting of the I's and the crossing of the T's. So now, I mean, in this election campaign in Sri Lanka, we've had election manifestos, we've had blueprints, and we've had a lot of documents that have been put out with varying degrees of detail. You know, but what we need to ensure is that even if what they say is not done exactly as they say they were going to do it, that they move in that direction at least, so that there is a certain amount of demonstrable good intention in trying to pursue what they said in their manifestos, and that they were not blatantly coming out with a whole lot of lies. You know, but ultimately, I suppose the thing is so that, you know, very few of them actually fulfill anything that is in their manifesto. There is a general sort of forgetfulness about a manifesto, maybe 6 months to a year, once a government comes into office, and therefore it is also incumbent on civil society organizations to keep reminding both government and people that this was what they said they were going to do. Have they provided us with a sensible, rational, legitimate explanation of why they can't do it in full or in part?
Dr. Saravanamuttu, in terms of future government, what should they be looking at when looking at the concept of bringing forward a new constitution? What about the issue of power sharing and devolution? What of the abolition of the executive presidency? These are key issues which about which promises have been made across the board.
Yes, I mean, I take the position that what we have is a severe, serious crisis of governance.
Right.
And that the social contract in this country is in pieces. No institution or process functions anywhere in the way that it was supposed to. Impunity rules. So we have to therefore reconstruct that social contract, and in order to do that, I think that founding document has to be a new constitution. Now people will say, look, we've tried to come up with a new constitution ever since 1978 and we'd fail because there are endless consultations. All right, fair enough, but then we can take the most egregious part of that new constitution, which is the abolition of the executive presidency, and I think that most people in this country would support the abolition of the executive presidency because it has so much power consolidated, vested and consolidated in that office, and as a consequence it also has a bearing on corruption. You know, as I've said before, you know, it's the president who appoints ministry secretaries. The ministry secretaries are responsible for the way that the finances in a ministry are used, you know. And furthermore, the justification for the executive presidency was that you needed strong, stable government. And of course we've had, what, 2 insurgencies, one in the south and one in the north. We've just come out of that, or not just come out of it, we've come out of it for 15 years. We've now had an Aragale to turf things out. I mean, what did the executive presidency do? You know, they say that the executive presidency was necessary to defeat the LTTE. In this country, as well as in other countries, prime ministers have dealt with emergencies of that kind without having to go to an executive presidency. So I don't think that argument stands. That has to go. You see, the other thing is, with regard to corruption, I would say that we need to restructure the office of the Attorney General. There is inbuilt into it a conflict of interest. The Attorney General is supposed to be taking cases with regard to corruption and whatever else on behalf of the government, but it's also advising the government and defending the government in court. Now most of these cases are against the government, and so we need to have a separate public prosecutor's office as well. I mean, those are 2 low-hanging fruit, if you like, which we can deal with.
Yeah.
With regard to power sharing, I think all the candidates have said that they will implement the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, that is part of the law of the land, and so there is no question with regard to it. However, some have said that they will do it immediately. Others have said that they will, you know, come up with a new constitutional reform process, and that could well be a part of it. The 2 parts of that amendment, that is land and police powers, those are the outstanding ones which have not been given to any province. Now I know some candidates have said that they would not give police powers, whereas land they're perfectly willing to concede. But we need to find out as to whether that's going to be the case or not, you know, and definitely power sharing must be part of that new social contract. In the current election campaign, at one level, the whole ethnic and religious dimension, if you like, which hitherto had been up front and center, has now receded into 2nd or 3rd place, because it's the economy that everyone is focusing on. But we do know at the end of the day that to build a new Sri Lanka, we have to build a new Sri Lanka based on the notion of unity and diversity, acknowledge that all communities have a right to live in this country, and yes, with that right as citizens go duties. So we really have to think of a new vision of Sri Lanka, or maybe it might be a reworking of the old one, but without that overarching vision, I don't think we're going anywhere. The economics of it, I think, are instruments. It's about the how. But we have to ask ourselves the question of the what and the why.
Is there a trust deficit between the state apparatus and the people?
Oh yes. Oh yes, I mean, you know, we do public opinion surveys. We have Social Indicator, which is our survey arm. Every single survey has shown that it's only the judicial system and the army that have any kind of public trust. Political parties and the police are way down at the bottom.
Isn't that heartbreaking?
Yes, it is heartbreaking. It is heartbreaking, and that is why I say that social contract has to be redesigned. And we have to have new blood in politics that is untainted by any of the past scandals and alleged atrocities and all of that, if we're really going to rework and remake the system.
I wasn't expecting a heavy conversation tonight, but okay. Sankhitha, I'd like your views on the asset declaration aspect. There used to be a secrecy provision which we used to talk of years ago, and then that was done away with. But now the latest deterrent is the redactions. Speak to us about it. Take us through it comprehensively.
Right. So the current position in the law is that certain designated persons, including election candidates, key public officials, and public representatives, including the president now under the new Anti-Corruption Act, they have to file their asset declaration with the Bribery Commission, the Commission to Investigate Allegations of Bribery or Corruption, or CIABOC. And then within 1 month of that, CIABOC has to make that information public, right? And the law, now this is great. It has been won after years of advocacy by civil society and many other elements pushing for this. So it's a huge victory that this has now begun to be implemented. We see about 300 asset declarations on the CIABOC website. It's a huge victory. So I would say we've taken 2 steps forward with the publication of asset declarations. We've removed the criminality provisions. We've allowed public access to asset declarations. And by this, what are we trying to do? We are trying to remove the possibility that public officials and representatives are unjustly enriching themselves through their public office. Like when they come into power, that they use that to enrich themselves. We're trying to prevent that. And we are also trying to remove conflicts of interest. So when the people can see that a certain person owns a certain company, and if that company is bidding for a government contract, then you can see that through the publication of an asset declaration. So we've come a long way in that direction. However, we saw quite to our surprise when the asset declarations were made public by the CIABOC that there were spades of information that were redacted. So if our viewers were to go and look at it right now, when you look at an asset declaration, you will see large sections that are actually blacked out. So ostentatiously, the justification for this is that this is private information. So if it's available to CIABOC and the authorities, that is sufficient, but the people don't have a right to see this. But I am in complete disagreement with this, because why we brought an asset declaration transparency law is for there to be public accountability. And if you look at the objectives of the Anti-Corruption Act, it talks about public accountability. So we've taken 1 step back by applying the law too rigidly. The law, of course, says that deposit details should be redacted, but that doesn't mean bank balances. So it doesn't mean that bank balances should be redacted. How can we have public accountability if the bank account number is redacted? That's fine. If the individual deposit details are redacted, that may be justifiable. But if without the bank balance, how is it an asset declaration? Right? In the same way, we have seen the names of even adult children having been redacted. So, and we see in the asset declaration form that valuations have not been required of land and property and things like that. So the utility of it is quite limited for that public accountability bit. So we are hoping that there will be further consultation as CIABOC enters into the next phase of taking this into an electronic asset declaration system that can do verifications, that can cut across other databases like the customs database or the Indian revenue database, because they have the power to do that. While they transition to that electronic system, that they will consider expanding what they make accessible, what they get access to themselves, what they require to be declared, and what they publish to the public, because that is how you allow the public into this conversation around corruption and around democracy.
My final question to the both of you. It is imperative that the new president must feel the pulse of the people, must feel the hunger of the people, must feel the tears and the pain and the heartbreak and the heartache of the people, the suffering of the people. How do we bridge this gap? What ought a new government do? Dr. Saravanamuttu.
Well, I would argue that it's precisely because of all of those things that we do not need an executive president, and therefore we should get rid of that office and bring it back to Parliament. Furthermore, I mean, I don't see why well, in this case now we have an executive president, but the head of government, the head of state, cannot give regular press conferences, where the press, as opposed to just even Parliament, where the press also, as in fact spokespersons of the people, can ask questions, you know. So you don't want a situation in which you have an almighty president who does tours around the country and has his officials with him in tow, and he asks people what's the problem, and then he turns to the official and says, now just fix it by such and such a date. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about here is genuine empathy and genuine sensitivity towards what their problems and grievances are. And so that depends ultimately at the end of the day, I guess, on the personality of that leader. Is that leader willing to continue that conversation of governance, and continue that conversation of government and governance, not in a position of, you know, the monarch who goes and sort of hears the grievances of the people, but rather at a more equal level where it's a partnership.
Sankhitha?
I'll add one specific thing that government needs to do. One problem that we have is that the public sector for Sri Lanka, when you look at it, it's an overly complicated public sector that is set up for political patronage more than for the efficient delivery of public service. And recent research that Verite research has published on a blueprint for rational government actually proposes a solution to this problem. And it gives a structure of a 15-ministry government that can run efficiently and can carry out every single function that government needs to carry out. So I'll end with that specific point in addressing that specific problem, that we need rational government, and the solution is already out there.
Thank you very much for this most comprehensive conversation and discourse, Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu and Sankhitha Gunaratne. Thank you for watching us. Good night.